Welcome, everyone, to the Alliance's webinar on philanthropy and conflict. My name is Heba Bushnif, and I'm the Arab region representative for Alliance Magazine. Today, we're addressing a very critical and timely issue. We are witnessing a rise in violence over the past decade. Over the past 3 years alone, there has been a record number of conflict-related deaths in the past 30 years. And this is not counting the indirect deaths that relate to inaccess to health, basic health services, or what's happening, for example, in Gaza in terms of starvation and other non-battle related deaths. The Global Peace Index indicates that the war costs the world $19 trillion. Just to put it into context, that's 13.5% of global GDP. Against this backdrop, there's a low level of philanthropic engagement in peace building or conflict resolution. And this is confirmed by the findings of a survey that was published in 2024 by Alliance Magazine. This is also confirmed by other country level surveys. But we do know that social justice philanthropy addresses some of the root causes of conflict, whether it's exclusion, poverty, or human rights violations. And at the same time, one thing that is clear from the empirical evidence is that poverty, the high incidence of poverty, there's a correlation between high incidence of poverty and violence, the outbreak of violence. Social exclusion is something that philanthropy works on. Trust building are fundamental values to the sector that undergird its work, which is also a necessary element for conflict resolution. So perhaps there are more interrelatedness between philanthropy and peace-building work than meets the eye. We are here today to dig deeper into the dynamics and drivers behind this low philanthropic engagement in peace-building and conflict transformation. We are joined today by incredible panelists who are thinkers and doers in the space of humanitarian relief and conflict resolution. They also represent regions that are considered by the Global Peace Index least peaceful contexts. And I guess the audience can guess why I was chosen to moderate this session. So I would like to introduce our panelists for today. I will introduce them alphabetically. We have with us Fadi Al-Dairi. Fadi is the Regional Director of Hand in Hand for Aid and Development. This is a Syrian diaspora organization that supports Syrians affected by conflict and displacement through humanitarian relief and development solutions. He has direct experience engaging in peace process in Syria. Susan Najambi is Alliance's East Africa Regional Representative. She's a social development specialist focusing on local giving and facilitating community development initiatives. Dr. Susan Rizal is a feminist peace builder. She's the CEO of Citizens Voices. This is a peace building organization in Nepal that works with women and youth affected by conflict. So I'd like to start with my first question to the panel. So peace building is a field that brings diverse actors, disciplines, and approaches. But we don't know enough about the linkages between philanthropy and peace building. So I'd like to address my first question to Susan Rizal. In your extensive experience in peace building, in the context of the Nepalese, the conflict in Nepal, can you shed light on what does philanthropy work in peace building look like in your context?
For me, what I feel that, the philanthropy and peace building are very much intertwined with each other. But how the understanding of the philanthropy in Nepal mostly understood by, the people is just, giving or receiving only. But what I feel is philanthropy is also, a kind of building trust among the people. And also, it also operates where the social injustices are there. And also, it operates to establish or to restore the human dignity. And peace building is also like this, it also works in the area where there are social injustices are there, where the legacy of the armed conflict is there, or where the legacy of the social conflict is there. But this kind of understanding is very much limited. But as far as my understanding and from my organization, Nagarik Awas, my founder, who also founded TEWA, the other organization, this is a philanthropic organization and also only one women's fund in Nepal. How they educate people about the philanthropy, which is teaching from a long time, how it operates, where the social injustices is there, and they again founded Nagarik Awas for looking at the impact of the armed conflict, which is mostly also instigated by the social conflict which was already exist in our society. So it's a very tricky phenomena also the very tricky spectrum, but I feel that it is very intertwined among each other.
Thank you, Susan. Susan Najambi, your experience in local giving, can you shed light on what does philanthropy on a local level engage in peace building look like? And can you give us some examples?
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. Yeah, so I think one of the things, picking up from where Dr. Rizal has posed, is that there's been a lot of focus on philanthropy being more of external support. And especially within the peace building space, there's been a lot of documentation and appreciation of external support in peace building efforts. However, based on the studies that we've done, evidenced in places like Libya, in South Sudan, is that local communities have continued to practice philanthropy, not just in moments of peace, but also in moments of conflict. And this has been evidenced by how local communities have been able to come together and give towards supporting not just one another, but giving towards ensuring that the space in which they are living in is able to ensure social justice and equity. Unfortunately, because of how philanthropy has been structured, with a focus on looking on financial support, with a focus of looking at it from the international development frameworks, local giving has been undermined in that sense. And so one of the things that then we need to begin doing, and one of my call to action to us who are here, is how do we begin to appreciate the local giving practices that are actually supporting peace efforts? They're few and far apart in terms of global perspective, primarily because they haven't been documented, but they do exist. And how do we use these local giving practices that have shown that they are providing solutions to actually inform our global practices around peace building and conflict resolution? So I think those are some of the things we really need to think about because they do exist. The challenge that we have is that there's limited documentation of this.
Thank you, Susan Najambi. Ferdi, I'll turn to you. Can you shed light on this philanthropic engagement in peace building and conflict resolution in your context, in the Arab region, or the Syrian conflict?
Yeah, thank you, Hiba. And it's interesting hearing to Dr. Rizal and Dr. Ngambi. It's for us in Syria, there is a lot of ambiguity when it comes to philanthropists and their role. I mean, after all, the Syrian context, it's a highly politicized one. And this is where I think they're trying their best, philanthropists, but we're not seeing who's funding any peace talks. For us, it looked like it's countries and governments who are funding it, but it could be philanthropists behind it. But maybe they have a fear or risk. I mean, they're worried about being categorized, as in taking the side of opposition or taking the side of the Syrian government or regime in this context, or maybe taking the side of Russia or Iran. I mean, we have so many parties involved in the Syrian context. So this is where we don't see philanthropists. They might be in the background, but they're not publicly coming and talking about their work and the peace building. We often see more foreign philanthropists, non-Syrian philanthropists, let me put it, maybe involved in peace building. And I think that gives them more flexibility because they are seen as a neutral. But for us, no, not the Syrian ones, unfortunately.
Thank you, Fedi. Susan Rizal, I'd like to turn back to you. You have extensive experience in peace building and conflict resolution. Maybe if you shed light on, because there's some ambiguity on the kind of process that are involved in peace. And there seems to be like a spectrum. There's peace building, conflict resolution, conflict transformation, a lot of terms. Can we break it down a little bit for the audience?
Mostly from my organization, we basically use the term conflict transformation, the conflict management is to manage to prevent the conflict or to manage the conflict, and conflict resolution is where the conflict is going on, we solve the conflict, but it is not transformed. The legacy of the different kind of conflicts which exist in our society, it is not transformed if we just work into the philosophy of conflict resolution. But if we work with the understanding of the conflict transformation, we also go into the deeper level of different kind of multiple level of the problems of the society. Let's say the structural kind of violence or the cultural kind of violence. We only not, work where we see the direct violence only. That is how it is different. The terms are, relatively different than each other. So basically, our emphasis is always working into the conflict transformation. That's what we do. And mostly we work with the women who are affected by the armed conflict. And still we have been working with them because their contribution has not been, recognized by the state in this peace building process. And we have been fighting for, the rights of the justice of the women. And here I'd like to recite one of my poem. What is the condition of women in this peace process only? It's just a synopsis, and this is just the scenario where we are as a woman, in every country where a big kind of conflict or the protracted conflict goes on, women's voices are never been heard. That is how I felt like that, and I just wrote one very small paragraph. I'd like to recite for you all, and you can imagine what is the condition of women now. Okay, I, the woman, not accommodated in the meaning of peace, amidst the brutality and power, living and surviving species on its own, on the dichotomy of peace and war, searching for the historical and transcendent. This is the situation of women. Wherever I go, I see this kind of context. And only where if we work for the conflict resolution, such kind of transformation doesn't happen. That is my understanding, Eva.
Thank you, Susan. Fedi and Susan Najambi, would you like to comment on what Susan just said in terms of the focus on conflict transformation and resolution?
You go, Susan. Start, please.
Posing so that you can go, but it's fine. Yeah. Yeah, and I think as Dr. Rizal has said, when we really think about defining conflict, I think we look at it from a very singular perspective. We feel we have a limited understanding of the scope in which it actually it entails. And I think one of the things that I think we need to bring out is the fact that conflict does not happen in a vacuum. It's a cause of social injustice. And so even as we are having this conversation, and even as we're looking at it as transformation, do we understand that the root cause of conflict has elements of social injustice? And are we responding to it from a social injustice lens? And I think that's one of the challenges that we continue to face, even as we seek to respond to peace, to contribute to peace interventions, is that we have had a very limited perspective of looking at it from an aspect of response to conflict, not looking at it as an aspect of response to social injustice, so to speak. And I think it's important for us to begin, even as we have this conversation today, looking at how do we begin to respond from a social injustice lens, as opposed to looking at it just as a way of bringing back peace.
Freddy, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, let me, I mean, I compliment or I echo what Susan Ngambi just mentioned. In addition, I think most of the time when we talk about peace resolution or conflict resolution, no matter how much effort we put in as individuals, I think politics would play a bigger role. I mean, we are driven and governed by politics. Uh, After all, when we sit, I mean, when we used to sit as Syrians from all sides or different regions, we are in agreement. We need to find an end to this conflict. We need to find a resolution. But then when it go to back, I would say the minorities who are actually ruling different sides of the or represent different sides of the conflict, they are the ultimate decision makers, and they tend not to listen to us. But for us, we tend to find the common ground between us as humanitarians or as civil society. But the final say is done by our politicians or politicians representing different sides. So no matter what we do, uh, yeah, we remain. I mean, our hands are, uh, yeah, tied. Like,
I think it's interesting that you're highlighting different elements of this peace building and conflict transformation. So there's the politics, of course, that's very important. And I think Susan, you, Freddie, pointed about, politics inclusion in the political, in the negotiation process. But Susan, you also talked about, injustice. And Susan Rizal, I also think, talked about this injustice and about, conflict prevention, that long-term kind of thinking. And that's what we really want to understand, because we know that lasting peace takes commitment. It's something that donors don't usually donors, or maybe in our context, like the Arab region, there's a lot of focus on humanitarian relief and assistance. So I'd like to ask actually you, Betty. You work in both humanitarian assistance and development, and you often talk about that there's this reluctance of donors to shift from humanitarian relief into funding transformative and lasting solutions. If you could kind of shed light on why are donors reluctant to engage in the space of lasting solutions or transformative solutions? And does it have to do, and I think you mentioned the political side, but I'd like to hear your take on this.
yeah, I mean, I would hate to say that the humanitarian response is politicized, or let's say highly politicized. When you look at different donors, different donors funding different regions or different interventions inside Syria. So I'm only talking about Syria. This is where the bulk of my experience. When we look at, I mean, for us as a humanitarian and civil society, we try and engage the community. We try and get them. I think Susan Nagambi, you mentioned the social injustice. People on the ground, they need to find a job. They need to live on a day by day, regardless of who's representing them politically. But the donors, for example, again, when I look at the philanthropist, they're more happy, they're more willing to fund UNDP for a livelihood project than funding a local NGO for the same project. So they think, okay, I'm safer there. Nobody is going to stereotype. Nobody is going to judge me or judge my organization. So this is one of the challenges we have. Uh, yeah. So again, when it comes to donors, we have a challenge in Syria. when is the right time to move into the development phase or early recovery, as we call it in Syria now? So in Syria, we move into early recovery, but that would be different donor because currently we have the humanitarian ones who are responding, while the development one and early recovery one are different donors or slightly different donors. So, for example, when you look at USAID, they are different from the BHA side, even though we see them as one. We see them as the Americans, for example. But the yeah, it that's the reality. Different donors. Back to you.
Thank you, Fedi. Susan Rizal, why do you think that philanthropy is not engaged enough in peace building and conflict transformation?
Uh, Actually, I echo what Fadi has said. It is, they are mostly, the philanthropists or the donors, they are mostly reluctant to fund the conflict transformation or the peace building work because this work are mostly politically sensitive and also very complex and risky also. And this is also a very mysterious path, While we enter into the process of peace building, it's all about mystery. The process leads us. We don't know what happened next, that kind of thing is also there. And it is very also challenging to monitor and ensure measurable outcomes, where mostly, donors mostly ask us to, prepare the log frame, and the work of peace building do not fit into the framework of log frame, or they say theory of change. There's so many terms that what we have been hearing from past 25 years or 26 years. So we also need to understand or need to alter the language and the understanding and the definition of the conflict, so that we can go beyond the impact of the armed conflict, but other social injustices, other social conflict we need to work on. And while I reflect in Nepal, donors are very much reluctant to to invest their funding, especially into the peace building work, because we are in a transitional phase, and the issues of the transitional justice, it is in limbo, you know and the donors are very much reluctant because it is a very political issue, and they said that the transitional justice act is not according to the international standards, and in the name of international standards they are not supporting who are working onto the ground, who are saving lives, especially women who went through from the such a sexual brutal torture and rape, and they are just waiting how the transitional justice act will be amended, so that they can also bargain, go with the government, but people are dying, so that kind of broader understanding of the human lives also need to be understood by the donors. That is my real experiences, what I have been just sharing from my heart. I've gone through a lot, and also somehow sometimes, mostly whoever comes also, they want to support us for 6 months or 1 month, and we're talking about the transformation, we're talking about transforming the attitude, behavior, and the context of the people, and it is very, very difficult to work with in line with the donors agenda also. So we have to work a lot when we talk about peace building. Trust the local organization who are in the ground, give them a flexibility. They are the masters of their context. That kind of understanding is not there.
Thank you, Susan. I'd like to turn to you, Susan Najambi. Fedi, you'd like to comment?
Susan Ajami, can I just jump in quickly?
Yes, please do.
Susan Reisel, I mean, honestly, you just reminded me with what happened a few years ago. I was part of the peace talks or civil society talks. And we were told, like, okay, you know what, you just need to sit together and talk together. We were put in a meeting room 5 days, and I think we were meeting from 7 in the morning till 12 midnight every single day. And then on the last day, they came to us, okay, so what have you agreed on? It's like, oh no, we're not here to agree. We're here to discuss and iron any differences. But the organizers, they were expecting us to have a statement. And we're talking about three different sides, if not four different sides. So we need to agree on a common messaging. And that was the most challenging thing we need to find. It's like you said, Susan Reiser, uh, they expect us to change or shift mountains with a 6-month project. Yeah. And you have a conflict. I mean, for example, the Syrian one is entering the 13th years. So we have a huge gap between people. And neither myself or anyone else can or does have an influence on the civilians impacted by the conflict. So this is where again donors they see, oh, we need to see we can measure when we save lives with a project, but we cannot measure. I mean, when you mentioned the log frame, it just made me laugh. Yes, exactly. They see us as a log frame sometimes. It's easier to measure a livelihood project or an emergency life-saving project than it is with peace building. Sorry, I jumped in. Thank you. Back to you.
No, that's exactly what we need, Freddy. We need this interactive dialogue. So we're talking about the shift in mindset that is needed. So committing to more long-term programmatic funding or interventions, or but we also talked about this uncertainty and that donors are not comfortable working in uncertain contexts or the uncertainty of the peace process itself. We also talked about the language, that the language of peace building and conflict is very different, even from one group to another. Susan, I'd like to turn to you and hear, do these issues resonate in your context in East Africa?
And I think I'd want to look at this from I'd say, a two-phase perspective, because we talked about the manship. I think I also want to just focus on the infrastructure for philanthropy. And I want to look at it from both the local and the international. And it's very interesting that the international infrastructure, as I said earlier, is that most philanthropy have shaped their infrastructure based on existing international development financing practices. And so in that sense then, because they do not necessarily have a huge investment in looking at the development space, some of them then tend to look for what would call low risk, high return kind of opportunities. And in that sense then, for instance, in Africa, one of the most funded spaces is education and health. And one of the least funded spaces is peace. And it's because, one, there's been little investment in understanding the context around conflict transformation and peace building in spaces like Africa. I think the other aspect also is, even in recognizing, and as I said, we look at conflict transformation from a single perspective. We look at it from a reactive perspective. And so what happens is most philanthropy then have what we'd call rapid funds. And picking on what Faith is saying, that the focus on rapid funds means that we want this to be addressed quickly. But that's not the situation. When it comes to issues of conflict transformation and peace building, we need to appreciate it's a process that, yes, will be high risk, but it still does have return. And so the question is, how then does philanthropy infrastructure begin to redefine itself in a way that it's flexible enough to be able to get into the space of peace transformation? But beyond that also, it is able to establish infrastructure that helps to look at conflict transformation as that, a process that goes from one step to another. And beyond that also, we need to appreciate that indeed in the process of conflict transformation, there are milestones. Unfortunately, how we have set up our measuring system, as Dr. Raisal has said, it's with certain log frames and certain structures. But we need to appreciate that we need to also redefine what we are measuring when it comes to peace transformation. And I think for me, that's very critical. But then I also want to focus on the other side of philanthropy. And as I shared, there are efforts of local philanthropy where communities have continued to bring together their resources, whether it's time, whether it's in kind, to be able to respond to the social injustices that they face. And for communities, unfortunately, when conflict strikes, it's not a choice of run. It's a choice of how do we bring back the peace within the space we are in. And so most of these communities, what they have done is they have actually escalated some of their local giving practices to be able to be more effective in engaging in that process. So for instance, when you look at situations where, like South Sudan, where communities who have always been involved in social impact processes have been able then to look at, as opposed to just supporting processes around education, they've been able to sit down and see how do we use the resources we have to begin to respond to issues of displacement. Now, within that, there are indeed models that we need to begin taking up and taking into consideration for us to be able to see how have these local communities be able to transition from focusing on one social injustice to another. I think for me that is the most critical element that we need to start looking at, to be able to then redefine philanthropy infrastructure and begin to appreciate philanthropy for what it is, because philanthropy is about the value of humanity. Are we truly valuing humanity if, when conflict arises, we who have been giving in that space, what is our first reaction? It's very human. We run or we stop, right? And so we need to be able to ensure that we are putting in place infrastructure that can help processes within these spaces, so to speak.
Thank you, Susan, for shedding light on that infrastructure and the kind of the long-term issues, structural issues. I really liked your comment about, you know, the community, the resilience, being able to withstand these shocks, which is really, really important. But also, the panelists also mentioned this issue of educating philanthropists on the context, because obviously the context matters in terms of how conflict resolution takes place. What is the role of communities? What does peace building look? So the education element is also very important, as we can see. I'm mindful about time, and we have a very important question, and I really love how it's framed. The Alliance team has framed it, so I'm just going to read it exactly how they formulated it. So, conversation about peace are often about men on the ground negotiating with men in politics. There's empirical evidence that when women are engaged in peace process, that the likelihood of the peace agreements lasting is like 35% chance. So there's evidence supporting that when women are engaged in peace process, the chances are that the agreements will last longer. So of course, I'll start with Susan, because that's your focus of your work and your expertise. Can you tell us, Susan, what role do women have to play in peace process, and what should funders know about this?
In my experience in Nepal, women contributed a lot, in holding the communities in the time of conflict also, and also in the post-conflict scenario also. And we have not witnessed, the participation of the women into the negotiation table to the peace building process also. And their stories has been really distorted into the peace building processes, Their narratives has not been prevalent. However, in my experience, what I saw always, because I have been also observing the women building peace in terms of many of the South Asian regional countries also, let's say Sri Lanka or Philippines, or or in Nepal or in Thailand, most of the countries where mostly I visit, or in Colombia, or in Timor-Leste, where I saw and experienced that women always bring unique perspectives, experiences, and can address underlying social issues that fuel conflict. Besides this, women are the ones who hold their families and communities during the time of active conflict, in the absence of male members, in their homes, with their compassions and creative. Actually, women are very creative also, And supporting women means enhancing inclusivity and fostering sustainable peace at grassroots levels also. Now, what we see, the world is grappling with significant conflict and war, and resembling the resurrection of the World War II as well. When we look at, especially in Ukraine or Russia or the Myanmar or Israel, Palestine, so many. Though the technological aspects are different, the strategies are, it seems like it is similar to, the past world wars, and including the annihilation and cleansing of the certain communities. It is so disheartening to see the citizens from the countries, and among them also women and children, where big wars and conflicts are happening, having to bear the severe brunt of this monopolistic of the warlords. The value of being women are human are in questions. That's what I feel with the loss of humanity in the countries uh, which are facing protracted conflict, and also which are entering into the post-conflict scenario. So at this context, it is very unimaginable to feel how women, suffer physically, psychologically, with the losses and pain, because women themselves are biologically also are very much vulnerable. And when the war is in the very peak of the height of the state, mostly the warlords go into the community and they go into the search of the male members, and when they do not see the women, they commit such kind of the gross human right violations like rape and the torture. It seems like boys are always boys. That kind of scenario is there. However, during this brutal time also, women still strive to live their lives, and women play a critical role in holding their communities. That is why I feel engaging, or in any of the peace building process, from the beginning to at the end completing of the peace building process, women has to be included, because it's all about the process of inclusion, and also respecting their human dignity. That's what I feel in Nepal.
Susan, do you have any examples where women were engaged in a peace process and it led into positive or um, successful outcomes?
Yeah, although in Philippines we saw many of the women, they were mostly engaged while their, the peace accord was happening. But in Nepal, we haven't seen that. There was no zero participation of the women while our peace accord was happening, where our post-conflict scenario is going on, and also while making the policy to compensate the victims of the armed conflict, where our government, put the women whose family members were killed in the category of the victimized women, and also whose husbands were disappeared. They were also in the categories of the victimized women, but not the women who face sexual violence. Although they know this kind of incidences has happened in Nepal, but they want to silence this kind of cases. It is not in Nepal. This is also happening in other kind of country also. And if we look at the Rwanda also, how women has participated, or Uganda, women's participation we can see. But many of the countries still there is not. But in terms of the while we are going into the political establishment phase, there is a kind of representation in the parliament, but there is no meaningful participation. The decisions are not being heard. This kind of situation is there.
Thank you, Susan. So despite women being disproportionately affected by conflict, yet their voices are not represented in political, in a conflict transformation or conflict resolution. Susan Najambi, what is it looking like in your context? How do women engage in peace process?
I think we need to acknowledge that in especially in the Africa context, conversations and focus on conflict and peace building have largely been, yes, predominantly male because of our patriarchal systems, and even how the focus has been, I think it's similar to what Dr. Riza was saying, is that there's been a lot of I would say, focus on the gender norms. And so in the African context, men are considered to be the protectors. Women are considered the caregivers. And so the sphere of influence for women is at the home front, or the sphere of influence for men is at the community level. And so in that sense, then, in those situations, we have seen that then women have been at the periphery of peace building initiatives. But increasingly, and just sharing, for instance, what we have seen in spaces like Somaliland, women have been able to come together and have been able to form, because in Somaliland, for instance, in Somali, one of the things that we have seen is the conflict is largely because of the clan setting, so to speak. And what women have been able to do creatively is what they formed, what they call the ninth clan, where they say they're forming a clan that then who come on board to be peace builders. And they actually were able to come together and with their collective voice were able to really build their sphere of influence beyond just being seen as caregivers to actually being seen as contributors to the peace processes. And as I said, we really need to stop having this disconnect, because even at that level, caregiving has been looked at a very household level. But even in terms of conflict, the caregiving role that these women played was at the community level. And so they used that to be able to bring themselves to the table and demanded to be heard and were able to be within that space of conversations. But it's the fact that we continue to see that there's limited engagement, even where women have been able to be involved. And so we need to look at how do we begin to increase or empower some of these peace building processes to be more inclusive, so to speak, not just from a gender perspective, but also from marginalized groups that then face the brunt of the conflict, so to speak.
Thank you, Susan. I'm going to shift to you, Freddy. Are peace processes in the Arab region inclusive?
You wanted a one word, or can I just go on? In my view, no, they're not inclusive. I mean, we still face, I mean, with the Arab region, I think we're slightly better than other regions, maybe. Yeah, we're more inclusive. But when it comes to peace talks, no, it's being seen as a man-dominated or a male-dominated industry or negotiations. I mean, the majority, I mean, for example, when you talk about Syria, we used to be highly educated people before the war, and now we have a high rate of illiteracy, unfortunately. Now we're looking at the majority would see the female, sorry, not the majority, there is a good percentage that would see the female should stick to home and keep cleaning and cooking. And now they can't even focus on the upbringing of their children because they are struggling to meet their daily lives. They're struggling with the cleaning or finding a clean source of water, while the husband or the head of household is trying to look for a job. So they are under more pressure. So therefore, I think with the negotiation or peace building, it's something more than just a luxury. It's something it's like a dream that would be in the Syrian context. That's why we're only finding a handful of ladies who are actually focusing on peace building. So it still remain a luxury. They often sometimes they look at it as, oh, uh, religion, for example. I mean, in the Arab region, the majority are Muslims. So with Islam, they gave them the right for women. But when it comes back to culture, there is a backlash from the culture. And unfortunately, we're following the culture more than religion. So yes, it's still remaining a luxury, and it's absent in my view. In my view, back to you.
So I think most of you talked about this perception and culture. That's obviously a common thread in your interventions. Is there something that we can do as a community to change this perception and to kind of, empower women or highlight the powerful role that women can play in peace building? Susan Rizal.
we have to work on to this kind of cultural issues because it also a matter of patriarchy also, and it is very much ingrained in our society. And mostly I work with the women who faced conflict related sexual violence, in the time of conflict. We went into the armed conflict from 1996 to 2006. So in our culture also, our virginity or our sexuality are considered as the prestige issues for our families and the communities, and women who are, school going age of children, like from 9 to 15 or 16 years of age, they went through from this kind of brutal torture and rape, and they couldn't talk about their incidences in their families and also in their communities also. So that kind of cultural issues are very much ingrained. And what I also highlighted about, the funders reluctant to, investing on these kind of, the issues of the gross human right violation because of the countries, the policy and regulation. Always they are very much reluctant because they want to, save themselves for their reputation also, so that their relationship with the stakeholders of the government could not be, jeopardized. That kind of thing is also there. And now also we have been working with these women with the very minimal resources what we have. And we also have developed some kind of, the practices of philanthropy. It was in the time of my founder, Rita Thapa. We did that. We used to collect the money from the individual donors from Nepal also. It is not about giving money or only receiving, or we're trying to break the, the notion of the receiver and giver. Somebody is giving because they want to contribute for the society. That kind of dialogue also we used to do. And we also used to have some kind of discussion why we give also, what motivate us to give also. So that kind of thing is also not there. So we are in a very difficult moment in terms of investing or supporting women who face the impact of the conflict related sexual violence, because it is not in the priority of the international communities also, because they don't want to have, the bad relationship with our government. But women are literally dying. While they were raped, they were 15 or 16. Now they are at the age of 36 or 37. And also women who were at the age of 60, they are turned down to, 80 also, and the justice issues is not there. They need medical support. They need regular counseling. They need livelihood support. They need to transform the feeling of the guilt that they have done something bad for the society, because as I mentioned earlier also, our virginity and sexuality is considered as prestige issue. And if I am raped, I'm the woman with the bad character. That kind of thing is also there. So we have to work a lot to transform. That is why I say only working for the resolution, it doesn't transform the society's mindset and attitude and the behavior until and unless we couldn't change the, the attitude and the behavior and the mindset of the people, our context will not going to be changed.
Thank you, Suzal. These are very deep issues and very serious issues, and it really makes me wonder because all the conversations and calls by funders, to address gender equity and gender issues, and yet the role of gender in conflict is overlooked. It's really mind-boggling. If the panelists don't have anything to say about this point further about this women in conflict, there's a question in the Q&A. There's also a very interesting commentary in the chats, but I'm afraid we won't have the time to go through it. So I'd like to take this question. Abigail Connolly from Safer World is asking, what do you think the role of humanitarian principles, specifically impartiality and neutrality, is putting philanthropists off of funding peace building because they see it as too political compared to so-called neutral humanitarian work?
I'll take it.
Of course, I knew it. Go
I
ahead.
mean, you'd be wrong to think that the humanitarian response is neutral. I mean, we are impartial, but we're not neutral. I mean, we've been dragged in the Syrian context. I would love to work in all areas of Syria, but I am governed by different politicians, by different areas of control. I am unable to work in two. If I say we have four different areas of control in Syria, I can only work in one only. I can't work in two. Yeah, never mind four. So this is why we are. Uh, it's often it's might be easier sometimes. I mean, once somebody said to me, "You are one of those extreme humanitarians." I just want to stick to humanitarian and not talk about politics. So this is the comment. It's like that shocked me at the time. So that's why it's easier sometimes to work in the politics side because you need to talk to each other. But for us as a humanitarian, we often go to the extreme to show that we are neutral, but we are not neutral. We are impartial. Uh, so this is one of the challenges. I think one of the Susan Reisel, you mentioned something that reminded me of one of the local NGOs. They wanted to get women to talk and they wanted to educate the men, but they actually resorted to religious leaders and they managed to get some religious leaders to get men and women to talk under one umbrella. How can you stop gender-based violence, or how can you stop women being attacked at home, whether she's a wife or a daughter or a mother? The only way is by getting them to speak, and it wasn't an easy one. And I know my French really struggled, but she managed to get success from it. And I think this is the foundation of any peace talks. We need to start from the basis. Uh, Back to you. I hope I managed to capture the question. But no, we're not neutral.
Susan.
Well, to that as well. And mention that I think this is part of the challenge, as I said, around philanthropy and understanding the context. I think one of the things we really need to do is educate ourselves around conflict sensitivity. Because at some point, the aspects of neutrality in a situation of conflict will be lost. And that's because the fact that you've decided to address an injustice when either political interests are opposing that is enough to say you've taken a partial perspective. And I think for me, if we begin to acknowledge that then there are certain risks we will have to take to be able to ensure peace and conflict transformation, then it helps us to be able to be more effective in our response mechanism, so to speak. And so for me, one of the things I think we really need to acknowledge is, yes, we do practice impartiality and neutrality, but just like in every other program, project, and different spaces, when social injustice reaches a point that it's hurting humanity, then we have to take a stand. And it's a call to us to think about, have we established systems that help us to enable us to actually define what our stand is? And even when we are perceived as impartial, as partial, or when we are perceived to have broken our principle of neutrality, are we able to justify what that is, again, for the sake of saving and protecting humanity? We need to be cognizant that, well, some things in theory look workable. When it comes to the practice, there's a call for us to be able to ensure that we are consistently educating ourselves around some of these elements, so to speak.
Thank you, Susan. There's other questions coming up in the Q&A. So one of them is about Gaza, and it's about support, but maybe that's a humanitarian assistance question. Maybe Fedi, you might want to consider answering that directly for the chat, for the Q&A. There's another question by Caroline, and she's asking, given the protracted nature of conflict and the complex issues involved, I'd be interested to know how the panelists would define success, particularly thinking of M&E and reporting back to philanthropist donors. So yeah, it's back to that lock frame question that we talked about, that issue about lock frames and how do we report about success. It's a complex issue in itself, and I think that deserves another session. But if you can like quickly kind of telegraphically respond to Caroline's comments, how does it look like?
You want me to answer it? Well, I mean, first of all, let me start with the Gaza one. The Gaza one is a tricky one. My organization started responding from almost, I'm not saying day one in Gaza, but we have to respond, but we have to keep it quiet. Because after all, we are governed by the banks. We're governed by, unfortunately, the negative media in the West and USA. It's often, I mean, I was brought up in a society, yes, I'm originally Syrian, but born and bred in the UK. We think we have democracy, but no, we don't. We think we have a freedom of speech, but no, we don't have freedom of speech. We think, yes, we voted for specific MPs so they can represent us. They are good MPs when you speak to them personally, but when it comes to the parliament, they are unable to speak. So back to the point, where you have Gaza, Palestine, and you have Syria, you have some countries, we have the sanctions as well, sanctions regime. And these are some of the limitations we have. So yes, we want, you want to give, we want to respond as well, but it's often, if we speak too much, it's often we will be under the radar as an NGO or an organization. So they will put us on the radar and they could freeze our account any minute. So we have to be careful with what we speak. And this is where we team up with civil society sometimes. But yeah, I mean, the situation in Gaza, I think from day one when we started, no, let me not talk publicly about the experience. Yeah, back to you.
Thank you, Fadi. I'm afraid that we're coming close to our wrap up time, and we have some very interesting questions, but I'm afraid we're not able to take them. I'm really sorry about that. So I wanted to ask the panelists in our wrap up or concluding remarks to think about one thing that you tell a donor or a funder how about advancing philanthropic engagement in peace building. What would your advice be? One advice, one or two. Susan Rizal, please go ahead.
As I mentioned earlier also, come beyond, a kind of comfort level also, because peace building is such a political thing, and it starts from the complexity also. And it is the accountability of the funders to trust the local, the organization, the grassroots level organization, the national level organization, because they are the masters of the context. Just trust on their work, and whatever support you can offer, please offer without any kind of, the suspicion that what we mostly see. Without any kind of suspicion, looking at their credibility also. It is the duty of the, the donors as well to trust these kind of organizations who are working on this ground from almost, 25 to 26 years of, and still we have to, answer how you, monitor your success. And this is so disheartening to, every time we have to, qualify ourselves for funding. So trust us. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Susan Ajambi, one piece of advice.
So one, I think we need to appreciate that there are local philanthropy actors who have been able to really engage in peace building and conflict transformation. How do we then begin to document some of these successes and using that to be able to inform our global practices around philanthropy? And secondly is for philanthropy that is interested in engaging in areas that face high conflict situations. How do you begin to partner with local philanthropy and promote collaboration in those spaces for you to not only understand the context, but for you to have meaningful investment in some of those spaces. I think for me, that's a keynote I'll leave with.
Thank you, Susan. Fedi, one piece of advice.
Mine would be localization. I mean, have trust in the local NGOs and look at their proposals and fund that as it is. There was a question about the MND. MND has developed really well in most contexts. And I mean, back to Susan Razor, when you mentioned trust building, yes, have a trust in the local NGO because they know exactly what the needs are on the ground. So yes, localization, mine.
So thank you so much for our panelists today for this very insightful conversation. I wish we could continue more. And thank you so much for the participants who have shared their, interesting insights in the chat and also the Q&A. I'm sorry again that we couldn't tackle all these questions. But I'd like to close today and say that hopefully next time we convene in this conversation, it will be a more peaceful world. Thank you, everybody, for your time.